Okay, so thank you for the chance to talk here at your meetup this evening. My name is David Kane, and let me get my slides up here. So, for those of you who are here to hear the nitty-gritty talk on Kubernetes, this is be a slightly different take on things. One of the things I wrote a book a number of years ago around the organizational issues around sharing a software architecture, and one of the things we had observed is that a lot of times the organizational dynamics have a lot more to do with the success of the architecture than the actual technical attributes. And so I've got a bunch of metaphors drawn from biology and the world of nature that I think might give us some insights, some questions we had to ask about our organizations that might inform how we organize ourselves, how we communicate, how we approach our software. So the first of these is I've got an image here of fireflies in the summer in the forest. Hard to think about the summer right now with all the winter weather we've been having. But one of the things that can happen with these fireflies is they can start, blinking in synchronicity. Now, there's no firefly conductor getting them to do that, or no project manager helping coordinate them. Each of them reacting on their own brings them into alignment. And so it makes me wonder, what is it about the fireflies that allows them to get such agreement in unison with each other when we struggle with that in our day jobs? Before I go too much further, though, where'd my, sorry, my, why is this not, there. Oh, I see my problem. Hold on a second here. It's on the wrong slide. Okay. Before I go too much further, and lest you think that I'm suggesting that you try to treat your coworkers like bugs, I'd like to share my favorite quotation here from George Box. All models are wrong, but some of them are useful. So when we're thinking about these particular biological metaphors or how they might apply to organizations, the point is not here to take them literally, but to see if they can prompt some insight or conversation that might give you a different way of looking at things. So I spent some time working in the world of bioinformatics, helping building tools for cancer researchers to help them make sense of their data. And it was sort of a humbling experience. Imagine the most complicated software system you've ever worked on. Imagine it was really, really kludgely written. You don't have the source code. You've got a bug, and the bug is actually able to replicate itself and modify itself as it goes along to evade your attempts to solve it. And even then, I'm probably substantially underestimating the complexity of the problem of fighting cancer by at least an order of magnitude, if not more. But it's certainly a complex enough system. And over the years, we've gone from having computer systems act as metaphors for biological systems, or sometimes we've looked at them the other way around. And so I think it's an interesting area to try to look for inspiration for our own stuff. Now, one of the things that makes cancer so pernicious is that there's lots of different kinds of mutations that can happen that part of the toolbox for it to develop new capabilities to enhance its survival, whether it's getting rid of genes or duplicating them or turning them around or taking them from one place to and putting them to another. The question I think that this makes me ask, though, for our own organizations is, are we as vigorous about asking about how we can do things better within our own organizations? Are there processes we can get rid of? Are there things we should be doing more of? Should we be doing things in a different order? Should we have them be taking place in different parts of our organization? These may be mundane questions, but I think they can go a long ways to trying to understand how we can unlock the potential of our organizations. One of the things this results in, of course, in the world of nature is this tremendous diversity of life that can occupy different kinds of ecosystems and environments. But in our own organizations, I think we spend a lot of time trying to stamp out that diversity, trying to standardize everything. And I think it leads to an interesting question about what's the right level of our organization that we should be trying to standardize things, and where should we try to encourage this diversity of experiences and approaches to flourish. Now, sometimes this manifests ourselves in our organizations by trying to make things look the same on the outside if they might be different on the inside. I think about various kinds of platforms. Back in the day, we had Java trying to have an abstraction layer to make us not care so much about what operating system we're on. These days, I think it shows up a lot in the part of cloud platforms where you might be dependent. You can try to remove your dependency upon a particular cloud provider, but now you're dependent upon the cloud platform instead. This is not to say that these platforms are poor choices. It's just I think we want to be really explicit about thinking about at what level of the stack do we really want to have that dependency? Because on the one hand, you might be able to get a lot of value out of this. On the other hand, we might be like this picture up in the corner and might end up looking a little bit silly. Now, sometimes in nature, we find things that work and nature sticks with that. So what we have here on the left is a fossil of a horseshoe crab that's 100 million years old. The picture on the right is a horseshoe crab that is contemporary. Of course, they look the same, right? This is not to say that evolution doesn't have a place here. Horseshoe crabs experience mutation. They experience natural selection. It's just that this particular solution in nature is one that works. I think I find sometimes in our software organizations, we're so eager to try to do the things that are new, we sometimes move away from things that are tried and true and have worked well in the past. And so the question I might ask for our own organizations when we're doing things that are new, are we getting rid of the old things because they're just old, or really trying to do new things because they're making an improvement? Now, even when we have old technologies, there may be new ways that we can use them or leverage them. So in this particular case, we're seeing horseshoe crabs are being milked for their blood. Apparently, that's very valuable within the pharmaceutical industry. When I look at current organizations that are using legacy technology, you might say have an older programming platform or something like that. But are your developers working in that space using the latest IDEs? Have you been able to figure out how to, say, take an old technology and apply them in a new context? I think a little bit about how functional programming had gone into disuse for many years before it came up again in the world of distributed computing. So even if we have old technology and we are going to keep it around, we shouldn't necessarily assume that all the context around that legacy technology should be treated as a legacy as well. Now, even with all the evolution, incremental improvements and so forth, to pursue different kinds of environments and niches, we can still have disaster strike. Now, whether it was volcanoes or meteors that did in the dinosaurs, we can certainly agree that that catastrophe led to a rapid set of changes to life on this planet. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with Ken Schwaber many years ago when he was trying to, in very early days of Scrum and the Agile movement. At the time, this was not nearly as widely adopted as it is today. And I was asking him the question about, well, how is it that you get organizations to adopt something crazy like this? And he said, well, one of the easiest ways, of course, is to have an organization hit rock bottom, because once you've hit rock bottom, then they'll try anything. And I think that's still true today, right? That organizations that have experienced some kind of catastrophe are much more open to change than ones that feel like they're relatively comfortable. But it's in that space of comfort that I think we can sometimes not necessarily recognize the dangers to our organizations. And so how do we create the drive to change so we don't have to wait for a meteor to strike us to figure out how to make improvements? And and how are you driving that within your own organizations? Now, a lot of times I've got some of these metaphors I was inspired by various podcasts. This particular one I heard on Radiolab. There was an episode from Tree to Shining Tree. And it started talking about how trees within a forest can share resources with each other. I thought, oh, that's sort of cool. And then as the story went on, it got even more interesting and bizarre. So it turns out that trees share resources with the fungus attached to their root systems. The fungus can harvest minerals out of the soil and will share that with the tree. The tree can generate excess energy through photosynthesis and share that with the fungus. And then once it's in the fungal, the mycelial network, it can transmit across the network to other trees. Trees can even use this system in order to notify them of pests. So for instance, if one tree is under attack by pests, it could send a chemical signal out to the other ones so they can start trying to mount a defense against that. I thought it's fascinating because you go to a forest and look out and not see any of that. And yet it's really important to the success of the forest as a whole. And as I was hearing the story, I was thinking about an experience I had when I was working for an organization where I was part of an office that was promoting knowledge sharing within our company. And I worked for this guy who like knew all the things that were going on. And it turns out he smoked and would always hang out with the other smokers on the loading dock, which led our office to consider briefly the idea that, well, maybe our knowledge sharing program should be to encourage everyone in the company to smoke. But then we realized that would not work very well because if everyone smoked, we would not have to ostracize them to the loading dock. But the point is that there was this network of interactions with the company that was hidden that was actually transmitting important information across the organization. And it got us to thinking about how is it that we can foster and encourage these kinds of informal networks? Because for a lot of our organizations, the sharing of information and knowledge across the organization is like those resources that were being shared across the trees. You don't see this on any org chart, but it may be in fact very important to how our organizations are operating successfully today. And particularly now in these times of COVID, something that, you know, the proverbial water cooler is out there. How do we create and reinforce these networks? Another area of hidden biology that has garnered a lot of interest in the research community is the area of the microbiome. It's been estimated in some cases that there are 10 microbial cells in a human for every human cell. It led to the title of a book, you know, to be 10% human. And increasingly, we're finding that this microbiome is actually important to a lot of conditions that, you know, humans can experience illness, not because there's something directly happening, but because something wrong or unhealthy about our biome. And what I see in this story, I think about a lot of our software supply chains. If we think about any kind of software solution that we're delivering, our teams are actually only writing a relatively small portion of that code base between the kinds of libraries we're incorporating from open source resources and such, or maybe the platforms that we're getting from our cloud providers. If we think about the whole stack of software used to deliver our solutions, we're actually only directly responsible for the top little bit of that. How much attention are we paying to the rest of that stack? Now, some folks are able to, you know, do some things like, you know, say scanning the libraries for known security vulnerabilities and things like that. But the health of that ecosystem might be even broader. So for instance, are you relying upon open source components that don't have a vibrant community behind them, that don't have enough resources? Are they getting regular updates? Are you asking these questions about your supply chain? And so just as in the case of our physical health, where the microbiome is important to our ongoing, you know, livelihood, in the case of our supply chains, the health of that supply chain is important to the success of our software products. And are we paying attention to that? One of the ongoing questions in nature is, you know, what makes us human? We keep coming up with ideas of things that are distinctly human, like our use of language or our use of tools, our sense of self. And we keep finding animals, though, that can do all these things, and that somehow makes us feel less special. So what is it that makes us human? So there's a hypothesis out there that fire and our ability to cook with fire is the thing that makes us distinctly human. So the hypothesis argues that when we cook our food, we can extract much more nutrients out of it than if it's uncooked. And this energy is really important because our brains consume 20% of our energy just at rest. And so the argument goes that there's this feedback loop between having the brains necessary to capture and cook and prepare food gave us the extra energy to have a more developed brain, and that is the cycle that may in fact be the thing that has made us what we are today. The question I think this brings back to our organizations is, where's the fire of our organizations? What is the technology? What's the investment that we're pursuing that will allow us to get more out of the resources that we're putting into them? What's going to extract more out of the time that we're spending? What's going to extract more out of the investments that we're making? And are we consciously trying to do that? A lot of organizations, you know, people are so busy just trying to get through their day-to-day stuff, they're not thinking about, you know, how do we find the time for that other kinds of investments? You know, what's the proverbial cooked food of our own organization's ecosystems? One of the more impressive animals in nature, I think, are the various colony insects, the ants and bees of the world. You look at any one of them individually, they don't seem so impressive. But collectively, these colonies can do a lot. Bees, of course, are able to gather resources from around their hive. They can make honey. They're able to communicate with each other when they find an interesting resource to be able to share that with their hive mates, so they can go off and extract those resources. They can collectively defend their colonies. And we talk about there being the hive mind, right? That they collectively can do more than they can as a bunch of distinct individuals. And I was thinking about this when I was listening to Woody Zuhl talk about mob programming. So the idea of mob programming, if you've not heard of it, is that we have a team working around a single keyboard at a time. You rotate through who's operating the keyboard, and you're verbalizing as a team what it is that you want the person who's driving to do. And there's a couple of interesting things that happen when teams mob. The first one is that there's a lot of learning that takes place because people are verbalizing what needs to happen. Everyone on the team gets to hear that. The second thing is that for a lot of problems, no one person has all the pieces in their head in order to solve them. Maybe one person knows the customer really well. Maybe someone knows the technology stack really well. Maybe someone else knows the legacy configurations very well. But collectively, if we're focusing on that together, we can solve these problems really quickly. And if I've only got my team working on one thing, I'm probably working on something that's really important to the team. And so taking the same principle of my team collectively can accomplish a lot more than we can as individuals, is that we can build upon the hive mind idea and create our own little hive minds within our teams. What I'm doing now with my teams is we've got both, we use mobs both to spin people up. We also have regular standing mob sessions where people can bring challenging problems. And there's some teams out there that use this as their mode of operation exclusively. So we can learn some things from our little friends here. Speaking of little, one of the things that people are often asking in our field is, well, how do I scale? And I think nature has some interesting lessons when it comes to thinking about scale, and importantly, what the limits on that scale are. So for instance, we have cells, and we know cells to be tiny, but they can get relatively big, right? Between the smallest and the biggest cells are several order of magnitudes of difference. This image on the right is about 300 micrometers across, which is barely visible to the naked eye, but it's about the biggest cell that we know about. But the constraints about getting resources into the cell means that it's hard for a cell to get much bigger than that. It's actually much more effective for organisms to collect cells together. And if we have differentiation, we can have multicellular animals like whales and elephants. But even here, there are limits on size, right? So the blue whale here is our biggest sea animal. Elephants are among the biggest land animals. But we still have constraints on size, right? The gravity, the availability of food, the ability to maintain body heat, all these things factor into limiting how big these organisms can get. Well, what limits us as our teams and how big we can get? I think one of the things, at least from biology, comes from the notion of our Dunbar number, right? This is the number of relationships that people can sort of sustain in their heads at the same time. It's somewhere on the order of like 150. You may have 10,000 Twitter followers, but you don't really know them in the same way that the number of relationships we can really manage. And when I think about like the various kinds of, say, agile scaling frameworks, right? The way we deal with people who are in an organization of 500 is fundamentally different from the way that we can deal with people in an organization of 100 or 10. And when we're thinking about how we structure these things, not only do we have to think about like how many people does any one person within this network have to deal with, but what are the boundaries? What are the signals that these sort of units are responding to? And so we think about like the behavior of a cell, there's some really distinct boundary, and that boundary both keeps things in, keeps things out, and selectively has things that can flow across that boundary. And so when we're thinking about the design of our organizations and the units that we're going to have, we can look to what are the constraints? What allows us to be small? What are the advantages of that? What are the limits that we encounter when we get to be bigger? One of those limits is how we communicate. Now, our bodies have lots of different ways that information is able to travel. So we have our nervous system. One of the interesting things about the nervous system is it's really fast, right? So, I can touch a sharp object and my brain almost immediately knows that I've encountered something sharp. But we also have our endocrine system, where chemicals get secreted through our body that can drive profound change. Think about how our bodies undergo change during our adolescence. The thing about the nervous system is it's fast, but it's also ephemeral. The endocrine system is slow, but can have really lasting effects. To me, the nervous system is equivalent in our organizations is like email, right? We can send in a piece of information really fast, get out to a lot of people, but how often do we forget about that email, 30 seconds later? Whereas to me, the endocrine system is like the culture of our organizations. What are the stories we tell ourselves about why our organizations are successful, why our organizations are not successful? When we're trying to drive change in our organizations, this endocrine system, I think, in a lot of ways is a much more powerful staying effect on how we perceive things and what will drive people to adopt change or not adopt change. So when we're thinking about more broadly about how we're organizing our systems, whether it's for scale or just effectiveness, we should keep these three things in mind. How big can things get? What are the constraints on that? What's the equivalent of our nervous system? What's the rapid communication? And where are the stories coming from? And how do we shape those stories? The last metaphor I want to share here is about legacy code. So one of the things that happens with genes is as they're passed on from generation to generation, if the gene's really important, it won't change, because if it gets changed and the organism is no longer successful, then that gene does not get to be propagated. And so it gets really interesting to see which genes are the same over time. This one on the right is one of the oldest, and it's estimated to be perhaps a billion years old in basically the same form. Bananas, we share some 40% of our DNA with a banana, because those genes are important to life as we know it. A lot of times when we write code, we think that that's not going to last long, and we don't spend, I think, the care with it. But sometimes our legacy code can stay around for a long time. In fact, sometimes far longer than we ever expected. Of course, we don't have any legacy code that's a billion years old yet. But you don't want to be the person where you're looking at some code and you're like, what jerk wrote this? And you realize, oh, wait, that was me a year ago. So when we're dealing with our code, I think we should give some thought to making sure that we're prepared for it to be around a long time, because it may be, and it may very well be you're the one who's stuck caring for it. So to wrap up, I've shared a whole bunch of different metaphors. Hopefully some of them struck you as interesting, and hopefully maybe some of them will cause you to ask some interesting questions about how you approach your organization or perhaps your day job. But one of the things I think is common across all of them is that there's this ongoing theme of decentralization. I think that that decentralized model is, I think, one of the things that gives many of these natural systems their resilience, and perhaps something that we can be able to emulate in both our approach to systems as well as to our organizations. And with that, I'll wrap up. You can find me at the usual locations here online. And if you got time, I'll be happy to take a few questions or comments. And thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you, David. I do have a question. What of all the different metaphors, I think as you went through each one, I could definitely picture a lot of, how it plays into places I've been or organizations I've been in. Is there one you think that I guess resonates more with you? One that you say recognizing it helps you adjust to the environment more?
I like the informal networks one as it pertains to that fungal network connecting the trees to each other. Mm-hmm. I think there's a fellow who told me the story. It might be apocryphal, but it doesn't make it not a good story anymore. So this organization had this very distinct culture. They were, they thought themselves very, very progressive, and they had been acquired by another organization that had thought themselves to be, very good and appropriate and all that. They just happened to be, politically very conservative. And when one got acquired by the other one, like there was like oil and water. The people just didn't mesh. And it had nothing to do with what was in their product profiles. It had nothing to do with what their organizational structures looked like. There's all this informal network stuff that wasn't visible to the people who were making these decisions, and it all went south. Um, and so, I think these, we can think about organizations as these abstractions, but at the end of the day, they're people interacting with each other. And I think that metaphor about how we connect each other as people is I think a really powerful one, and I think we forget that at our peril.
Cool, thank you. Any other questions for David? All right.
I don't necessarily have a question. Just a comment. Great presentation, David. Really appreciate it. Very informative. A couple of things that really hit home for me were obviously standardization, as well as for me scalability. Things that I'm working on right now in my job, and some challenges and some perks that I face with standardizing things and making sure everybody bites in and understands that standard is a good thing. But like I said, very good presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think on those particular things, there's an interesting tension, right? It's often easier to scale things if they're standardized. I think where a lot of organizations struggle is trying to find the right things to standardize on. Which is it, for instance, really important to everyone agree on the same programming language? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? Maybe you can get by with 3 or 4 programming languages. Maybe that's enough, right? Certainly in a world in which you have 40 microservices and all 40 are written in a different programming language, that's probably not ideal from an organizational perspective in terms of flexibility of resources and so forth. On the other hand, trying to force everyone to the same one, is that the right one, right? So I think those two demands are often at odds with each other. And I think the challenge is trying to figure out, where do you want to insist on the standards? Maybe it's around interfaces or particular conventions. Where do you want to give teams flexibility? Because one of the things too is that we know that people want to feel empowered and autonomous, but that means that they have to be able to make some decisions for themselves, right? And so where's the space for those decisions? It's, I think, an interesting challenge for a lot of people who are trying to work in this space of scaling things up.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you again, David. That was very good.
Thank you.
Let me go ahead and I will share my screen. There we go. All right. So mine is not going to be is going to be far more demo than slides. So, oops. There we go. So hopefully this all works. We'll see. Typically the demo guys will come along and mess up at least 1 or 2 of them. But this comes out of some work I've been doing for my client at DHS. One of the things we've been looking at is building out the right security tools for if they ever get some wider spread adoption of Kubernetes. They have some pockets of it right now, but they haven't really gotten too far. And they're looking to build a DevSecOps pipeline, or have a DevSecOps pipeline in mind, so that they can feel comfortable letting more teams adopt Kubernetes. So we're doing the same thing with non-Kubernetes, with just in the cloud on VMs, traditional type systems. And but this one came up with a lot of tools I was not aware of. I personally am not good at Kubernetes. It's new to me, something I've just started playing with. So these were the tools that, having done some research on them and played with them some, really seem to fill out, I guess, what to me makes the whole picture. So the first one I have up here, I'm putting up the slides only because that way you can read the text pretty well, and I'll go and show you how it works. But this first one is by Aqua Security. It's called Kubench. And I'm kind of starting at the top of the environment. If you were to manage your own Kubernetes cluster, if you were to go ahead and install it on VMs, you'd install the control plane pieces and they'd all be laid down just on a regular VM. And you could secure the VM itself just like you would do anything else. You know, if you're in the government space, you probably want to apply STIG. You can, all sorts of different scanning tools just to look at the system, things like Tenable Nessus, that type of thing. But once we get into how was Kubernetes installed, we want to look at something that actually understands how Kubernetes is supposed to be involved in that tool. These are all the ones I'm going to talk about are open source. So this one, Kubench, just really looks at that. Is Kubernetes installed and installed and configured securely? So go ahead over, find out where's the right one. So this one is a GitHub project. I have a little screenshot here for it. But it can be installed in a number of different ways. And one of the things this does is it compares the way Kubernetes is deployed by running a bunch of checks that are documented in the Centers for Internet Security Kubernetes benchmark. So they publish something that's very similar to a STIG, if you're familiar with those, but it's just their list of best practices. Make sure that these things are set, make sure that these things aren't. If you're doing this, you should do this too, that type of thing. Kubench, it just gets installed as a job that runs in the cluster. And it runs on the master nodes and the worker nodes and just returns back a list of kind of findings, things that pass and fail and that. So let's see if I can go ahead and get that to work. All right. This is the right one, I think. That was not the right one. Okay. So first, we get to the right directory. And I'm just going to go ahead and apply it. This runs, I have it checked out just from the Git project, and it's just a kube control apply, and it applies the job. And the job will go ahead and start up and run. And let's see if I have it up the lens here. You can go ahead and see that it's in there, and it looks like it's already complete. So I can go ahead and take a look at the output here. Oops, that's all I wanted. There we go. So got it. We got a Kubench, and in Kubench, I can go ahead and take a look at kind of the findings it has. And I'll scroll through it a little bit better. But in this case, it's just checking. This is just on my local machine that I have it here at home. So it checks out. These are the types of things it checks out for a worker node. It just logs them out. You can do a little bit of colorizing and everything if you run it on run the binary instead of running the Kubernetes job. But it tells you some things are failed, some things passed, and things like permissions and ownership and making sure certain file permissions are set and certificate authority are set up correctly, that type of thing. Some things it can check, some things it can't, some things are serious, some things aren't. And it does give you a little bit more detail down below, including how to go ahead and fix some of the stuff. So good. It's something to be used up front by the team that's responsible for installing Kubernetes and maintaining it anytime they set up a node. So it does it for the worker nodes, and then it goes ahead and it'll do it for master nodes and other systems. And that it depends whether or not you're using a managed Kubernetes or not. If you're using something like EKS or Azure's Kubernetes service, AKS, or something in Google cloud platform, of course you don't have access to the master nodes because they're managed. So you get to see just the worker nodes. And actually, even in like AWS, if you're using something that's too managed, like what's the name of it? Their service that's completely managed, you wouldn't even be able to see these nodes. But in that case, it's completely managed, so it's not your responsibility to be looking at. So anyway, good overview of how things were installed and things you can clean up, and it's easy enough to run this as a job. You just run the job and take a look at the logs, and it shows you kind of what things need to be fixed and some of the things you have to check manually because they can't check them automatically, that type of thing. All right, so that was the first tool. Next, the next layer down is the workload. So things like jobs and deployments and pods that are starting up. There's a couple tools here we're going to look at that'll do this, but the one that I've really liked has been Polaris by Fairwinds. It's an open source project. They do have an upsell to I forget what they call it. In fact, we'll see it on the webpage, I'm sure. But they have a commercial service that does more and gets more in depth. But one of the nice things about them is they can be used in a number of different ways, and does some really nice, easy to interpret graphs, some really good executive type summaries that make it good to show the results. And what it's showing is just looking at the workloads. Are they configured using recommended packages? It's a static analysis tool. That will also work as a dashboard, and that's the one we'll look at. But one of the other cool things I haven't had much time to play with is an admission controller. And an admission controller in Kubernetes is something you could set up so that it basically runs a static analysis as a workload is being submitted to the cluster. And if it doesn't pass, in the case of Polaris, if it finds anything that it labels as a dangerous, which would be like a critical type vulnerability, it will reject the workload. So it just won't let it come in, and it'll just fail to deploy. So you can keep things at a serious level out. And this works, like I said, pods, deployments, daemon sets, stateful sets, cron jobs. So let's go ahead and take a look at the website for that. We have, it'll run as those three. What was the tool? I thought they had it right here, but anyway. Oh, Fairwinds Insights. That's their commercial one. It just does a little bit more and tracks Polaris across a lot of clusters, things like that. So, all right, let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'll bring that one up. It's going to be, I'm going to go ahead and apply the dashboard. And there, it's already deployed in my network. One of the nice things that I liked about this too is it was fairly easy. I'm just going to do a port forward here. We'll look at 89999. I'll forward that. And if I go in here, do a local host. There we go. Go ahead and show what I found, right? And this is every time the page loads, it pulls up the latest for it. So it gives it a grade and a score, and a little bit stormy or clear sailing, things like that. Tells you the number of passing checks, warning checks. Dangerous is the stuff it would actually stop. Does its ad for Fairwind Insight. But it also breaks it down by efficiency, reliability, and security. So if you kind of tell you where the failings are, things are going to eat into your that are going to chew up bandwidth or memory and CPU, right? It could break things down by namespace, and you can see just those results at any time. And you can look into each of the namespaces and kind of see what types of findings it has. So this one, I have a Postgres installed just on a Kubernetes deployment, a stateful set, and you see there's a couple things that are okay. There's privilege escalation that should be not allowed, so I should clean that up. Don't set any limits for CPU requests or memory. Don't have a readiness or a liveness probe, things like that, right? So these are things that clean it up. And if you click on the explanation, it'll go ahead and tell you how to configure that that check, if you or customize that check. Gives you some background and then gives you some links to places where you can go ahead and do some remediation. So one of the things we really liked about this is just right at the top, it kind of give you the little scoring. And if I switch, let's go ahead and filter by namespace to, yeah, let's look at Claire. That's a good one. Oops. It'll go ahead and update the score to something different, right? And you can see this one is not very good, right? There's a lot of problems. It's because I installed it by hand. If I was to switch this off to Polaris, which came with an installer, you can see smooth sailing, A+, 100% score. Not too surprising their installer installed everything to patch their own checks, but that's a good sign, right? So anyway, Polaris, really good. Like I said, some of the nice things about it, the fact that it has the dashboard, the fact that
can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Why is it saying 17 passing checks, but it looks like like that circle graph doesn't match?
I think this is the overall circle graph.
Oh, okay.
I think this one stays the same in all of them. We can go ahead and see. Yeah, the circle graph stays the same each time. Good point.
I got you. Okay, thank you.
No problem. But like I was saying, the fact that you can use it to do static analysis in your CI/CD pipeline, the fact that you can actually use it to check things so that you can't submit anything with one of these dangerous checks that it would get rejected, seems like a really nice tool to be using in the pipeline that multiple teams are going to be using. So, all right, next tool. So that was getting the workloads in. The next two tools I think we're going to look at, they're both static analysis tools. And the only reason we actually used both of them, we just tried them both out. They showed slightly different things in slightly different ways, and they both run so quick that there was just no reason to restrict it to just one of them. This would definitely, you could run either or both of them. The first one is Checkoff by Bridge Crew. They also have a tool called Bridge Crew. That's their commercial version or their enterprise version. And this just looks at files that you have in your pipeline. It's really looking at all the different YAML files or Terraform files, ARM templates, serverless, CloudFormation, all of that. And you just run it against the tools. And you just run it against the files rather. And it pops up, here are the problems we see with it. It's just looking at, just are the resources configured properly? Are you missing things? A lot of the same types of things that you find in Polaris, but it's text-based and just doesn't have the same dashboarding, but it goes very, very quick, very easy to set up. I'll show you an example of the output and how that was run. So Bridge Crew right here. Again, on GitHub, really easy look to use to get it to run. I'll show you that. Spits out the code the results very quickly. One of the really nice things about this is since they have Bridge Crew, they have a really nice website for remediation advice. And if you, although it's not directly linked, if you just search for the finding that Checkoff gives, you can go ahead and you'll find right at the top on the Google list will be the Bridge Crew page on that finding with lots of information on remediation. Like a lot of commercial tools, their remediation advice is much better than the open source stuff. So let me go ahead and run that or show you the results of that one. Actually, let me show you how that one gets called. In our demo pipeline, we're actually running it in a container. But we're actually running it twice, and I'll show you why. The output comes out on the command line. We just give it the directory we're running this against, and say, on the command line, it's fairly nicely written out. But we can also, it's made to run in a command line and spit out in JUnit XML. So like a JUnit set of JUnit tests. And you can plug it right into the pipeline to have it fail and show the graphs in Jenkins, just like you normally would with JUnit tests passing and failing. So you can see the trending and all of that. So it works out very nicely for us to be able to run it both. And each run on this particular one takes under a second. So there's no reason not to. So let me show you what some of those results look like. Here's some output here. This is the checkoff running. It tells you which ones passed, which ones failed. Let's go with all the passing here. Lots of checks passed. Towards the end, I know there's some failures. So here, the security context, right? This particular deployment file, or this particular deployment file, sorry, didn't have any security context in it. It shows us the file. In this case, it's the whole file because that's the whole file was missing a piece. But if it's something a little bit more specific, it'll go ahead and show just that piece of the code to tell you where the problem is. It does have the link. I'm sorry, it does have the link to the bridge crew stuff with a lot of information on how to apply it, what to fix it, what it looks like in each type of workload. So really nice, really easy to run. We run it from a Docker container, just with there's a bridge crew / checkoff. And if you just mount your source directory and plug it in, it'll work too. Also, one of the things I've been enamored of lately has been running pre-commit hooks. And there's actually a package called pre-commit. And Kubernetes, checkoff is set up to run against anything you're checking in as a pre-commit hook. The only problem is right now it's configured to only run against Terraform files. And I haven't figured out how to get it to work against Kubernetes files as well. But again, it runs so quickly that that's a great place to run it. Just as you're committing code, you can actually have it stop your commit if it finds any problems. So anyway, very easy to use, very quick to run. We've been very happy with that. And we are using it for our checkoff files as well, even though we haven't adopted Kubernetes in our production environment. All right. So this next tool I want to go over, same level there. This one is by a company called StackRox. It's called KubeLinter. Same type of thing. This one looks at Kubernetes and Helm charts. That's the difference there is that we'll look at Helm charts. And it's just, again, static analysis, looking at the files, what types of problems does it see? We had some problems with the Docker image they included. It worked fine from the command line, but we couldn't get it to work from Jenkins. So we at Steampunk, we created our own. It's public if you guys want to grab it. And I actually have in the README why we did it. It just had to do with the way they had built the tool. It wasn't working with our particular Jenkins pipeline. So anyway, let me go ahead and show you it. Again, very, very similar Kubernetes YAML files and Helm charts. It's just checking against best practices. You can install all of these tools I've showed you. Almost all of them will run just from the command line if you want. So you can just run it, link to your files. This could also be set up as a pre-commit hook. In our test system, show you, that's the checkoff that you just saw. We just add another one to look at KubeLinter, and it just runs literally KubeLinter lint dot to let it go. By the way, these the or true at the end is because we wanted to see the results without failing the build. I wanted to continue regardless of what the results were, mostly because this is a demo and we just wanted to be able to see all the results from all the different types of tests we could run. So let me go ahead and take a look at that one. There's our Kubernetes run actually has the same KubeLinter right at the end of it. So let me swing down, past all this checkoff stuff. A lot more checkoff stuff than I thought. There we go. Okay, so this is a KubeLinter. Again, same types of things it's looking at. Finds a few different things. Let's see if the one. See, talking about the container, the security context in the ALB Ingress container controller. That was one I was showing you above. They have a link to where the details are. They tell you a little bit more about the check and the remediation. It's a little bit short and sweet, which might be better for you, might not, just depends on how you like to see it. But it's very clear, I thought, the way it wrote things out, tells you exactly the objects, and again, it runs so quick. Static analysis tools are really something I enjoy having because I like having clean code when I'm having to write it, especially for me right now when I'm just learning Kubernetes. It's great to have something to tell me, hey, I'm doing it the wrong way. Even if I could get it to work, you're still doing it the wrong way. So been very useful. And all of these tools, they are security tools, but they're also, best practices, and obviously that bleeds heavily into security, but also the pieces of security that people often overlook, like availability and just correctness that can lead to other problems later down the road that aren't specifically, I found, a vulnerability. So, all right. So, a couple more tools to look at. Next level down. So we've talked about how Kubernetes was installed with Kubebench, how the workloads are running, and kind of gating to them getting into the Kubernetes cluster with Polaris, and then looking at our different files, the infrastructure as code files, including all the Kubernetes YAML files with Chekhov and kubelinter. This next one is a tool called Claire. I'm not going to go ahead and install this one because this one takes a little while to install. It's a little bit bigger, and I'll talk about that in a second. But this one is actually looking at vulnerability data, looking for CVEs, outdated packages, that type of thing in the containers we're running. So we're further leveled down now. We're actually looking at the contents of the containers that we're running. This is by Key or K or Quay, depending on how you pronounce it. Which used to be part of Core OS. Now this is owned by Red Hat. And this tool is a little bit more involved for running it. And that's because it actually is a server, an API server itself, and it needs a database behind it. The server will sets a job that updates the data on in the database to download on a constant basis. It's actually I think by default, it does updates every 2 hours. So it's constantly checking it. And the server itself actually only provides an API that you need a front-end tool to go ahead and use it to scan. And what it's really set up to scan is containers in a registry. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but that's really what the key is. And if you know what key is, it is a Docker container registry. And so you can get scripts that can just constantly scan your entire container registry if you want to do it, stuff like that. I had a lot of problems, I shouldn't say problems. I had a lot of problems installing it because I'm not good at it, but I did find a lot of differing sets of instructions. The one that I found that I really liked was this one here. So you'd be able to get it from the video, that really had some straightforward, this is the right way to install it, and it got it working for me. And like I said, that stands up the database, and it stands up the server that keeps the database up to date and provides the API. The front end I used, oops, wrong tool. The front end I used was actually called CLAR. It's by OptioPay, and all it is a way to scan the registry. So let me go ahead and pull that one up and show you what that scan looks like. So here's the tool, right? We have the CLAR site. Again, it's another GitHub site. Instructions were here. Like I said, it walks through downloading all the pieces. CLAR, and then they have some instructions on how to use CLAR. That's also on GitHub. But let's see, do I have here it is, we're running it. So running it is actually fairly easy to do. We store our Docker containers, our local registry is in Nexus. So we pass the just normal Jenkins file stuff, passing the username and password for that hidden. And we go ahead, we install CLAR just on the container that we're running this on, our Jenkins nodes. Jenkins agents are ephemeral. And then again, I run this twice, kind of like I've done with some of the other tools, just show two different outputs. Can output in a table form or in a JSON form. I pass the permissions, run CLAR, and tell it on what. This job in particular is just building this Steampunk Foundry MVN JDK node container image. So it's going to go ahead and run that. And then I archive the output. So let me go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. All right, so let me shrink this down a little bit so you can see it. So this is the table form, and this is the type of output it spits out, right? Severity, what the CVE it found is, what package, the feature, links to the CVEs, right, for each thing that they find. So, it's actually going through the contents of the containers. This is something, on a VM, you'd be doing this with something like Nessus by Tenable. This is actually looking in at the containers, the container images themselves. And the way we actually run it, this one you'll see it's all mediums, but that's because we've actually configured it just to show me medium and worse. You can actually see it right in the command. This is the next version. I'll show you the JSON in just a second, but we actually tell it, this is the level we want to see. This is actually, like I said, scanning the images. So we actually build an image, we stick it into our dev Docker repository, and then we tell Clar to call Claire and search the repo for that image and go ahead and do the analysis on it and report back. And let's see. Oh, I think I can. Nope, that's not the right one. And of course, I'm logged out. Hang on just a second. I'll get back in and I'll show you kind of what the type of information they have in JSON. Yeah, so it's just tells you the number of counts and each of the vulnerabilities. I should have formatted this, sorry. But it gives you the details. There's a lot more information in each of these. It gives you the details, the CVSS scores, that type of thing. So if you want to get into the details, this is good. Our client is looking to push this stuff up into Splunk, where it's monitored by a SOC. So this type of information is the type of information they're used to getting and they want to see. And JSON is a great format for pushing stuff into tools like Splunk. So anyway, if you don't want to go through the trouble of setting up Claire and have the database running, I've set this up locally, so it's running on a container you saw earlier that's running Postgres. If I was doing this in the cloud, I'd just use an RDS instance or a hosted database instance. But if you don't want to leave those up and running for whatever reason, if it doesn't fit, there's actually this other project called Claire Local Scan. And it's literally somebody who wanted to use it in a CI/CD pipeline. So what he's done is built a container image, a Docker image with Claire installed, the database installed, and he updates this daily. He just has a job that every day grabs the latest database, the latest vulnerability data, puts it onto the database. So it's a static image each day that you can use and run against your system, so you don't have to go through the trouble of having a system up and a database up and running all the time. So, cost savings or something that's run really infrequently, you don't want to have to keep those systems up all the time. This is another option. And I did play with this. It gives you the same output as Clar. Or it was able to do the same thing with Clar. I actually used Clar as the front end before I got the other one set up, but works very, very well. It's updated once a day instead of every 2 hours. So, all right. And I skipped again. One more tool to look at, and this is kind of the lowest level. Falco by Sysdig is I've seen it listed as de facto security tool in Kubernetes clusters. So this is looking at the lowest level, and this is actually doing runtime behavior monitoring. It's actually watching system calls for all different types of problems that are running from the containers, between container networks, between namespaces, on the system, all sorts of things. It actually, if you do go through all the trouble of setting it up right, you actually need to make sure certain flags are set on your kernel, on the system you're running it on. So your master nodes. And it runs as a daemon set. It can run as a binary that's running right on the host system itself. It all depends. They have things installed. I'm going to show you running it in a container or in a Kubernetes cluster. But it's looking for anything that's not, oops, these aren't the right ones. Did I even bring up Falco? Probably not. These are looking at anything that's running, that's happening on the system as it's running, things that aren't it doesn't expect to run. So let me go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and fire it up and show you something. Get it to run. First thing I'm going to do, let's see here. Yeah. I'm going to take a look at the logs. I already have it running, so a lot of logs sitting there. I'm going to clear them in just a second. Let it scroll out a little bit. Okay. So that's my Falco logs. It's spitting out. There's a lot of problems with the way some of this stuff installed in K3OS. I'm using the default rule sets. I haven't tried to tune it at all. Again, I'm not good at Kubernetes, so I don't know how it's supposed to be tuned in a lot of cases. I haven't played with it at all. But let me go ahead and install, forcibly do something that it would pick up on so we can see it. I'm going to run a container, just an Nginx. Just going to go ahead and run that in a pod, and it'll come up. And I don't think we should have seen much going on. A couple of things changed, but nothing big. Log files changed. Some set UID, set GID bits were set. They're not really the most interesting part of this. This is just the log I'm looking at for Falco. If I go ahead and log into that, do an exec to get into that Nginx container, and I was to do a cat etc shadow, obviously that's something suspicious. We would not expect that to happen on a normally running Kubernetes cluster. And if I go in here, one of the things you see, the shell was spawned, right? That's a little bit weird, but also down here, a sensitive file was open for reading by a non-trusted program, right? These are the types of things it notices. And like I said, I have done no tuning. So, obviously on the way mine's set up, I'd try to get rid of those set UID, set GID bit warnings, or I'd fix them, one of the two, so they weren't clogging up my logs there. But it's telling us, hey, it noticed somebody catted etc shadow. And if I actually knew Kubernetes enough to get Grafana and Prometheus and all of that talking to each other, you could feed this information right in. It is made to be consumed by things like FluentBit or plug into Grafana, and there's exporters and stuff that'll tie in pretty quick. So you can see this, and there's a lot of examples of it. It just wasn't immediately straightforward to me, who, like I said, doesn't know Kubernetes well, so I didn't get that up and running. But this is looking at kind of the lowest level I can imagine that you'd want to be monitoring for most Kubernetes clusters. You have the high level of, I have the, how's Kubernetes installed? You have the middle, like how are the workloads installed? You have the static analysis of the files you're pushing out with Checkoff and Kubeliner. You have the how are my containers built? Or what containers? What are the container contents look like? How secure are those with Claire? And then Falco, kind of at the lowest level. What is it doing? Is there anything it's doing? Privilege escalations, ownership changes, weird programs being run, shells being spawned, anything like that I should be aware of. So that is all I have. Those are the tools. I'll add a link to the, I'll put this presentation up somewhere so you can get the URLs and stuff easier than having to retype them yourself. But yeah, that's about it. Any questions?
On that last one, does it give a sense of severity? Couldn't quite tell from that log there.
It does. I don't think it does, but there's a lot of configuration you can do that maybe it could be done. But by the default rule set, it does not. There's all sorts of information online about how to write your own rules and what types of rules you should be writing and stuff like that, though. So it would not surprise me at all. But Falco is probably the most popular of all of these tools. I'd say Claire is probably the next, but Falco is a whole ecosystem unto itself. So there's plenty of information out there on it. I might explain that.
And Claire works a lot like, Falco works a lot like Claire. You can export the files and like import them into Splunk or something like that, easier to read.
Yes, yes, and I mean, part of the reason I think all these fell in a little bit like that was that we are looking for tools that can be consumed, that our SOC can look at through Splunk. So we want to be able to feed the information into those types of tools. So it's a little bit of survivor bias here, just by the tools I picked were the ones that are going to do that. But yes, that seems to be fairly common in these types of tools. And we were having a discussion today about it. The team that's setting up Kubernetes, they're going to look at KubeBench. The development teams, they're going to use Polaris and Checkoff and KubeLinter. But then your SOC is probably going to be using Claire, and Falco. Your development team is probably using Claire as well, but the SOC is definitely going to be interested in monitoring those on an ongoing basis. And Mike pointed out during that talk, by the way, that StackRox was just acquired by Red Hat. So I think Red Hat has Claire and the StackRox tool, the KubeLinter, are both Red Hat tools now. Anyone else? All right. Well, hopefully that was useful. Oh, so go ahead.
One more question. With the KubeBench, is that kind of customizable? Like, can you customize specific things to look at, or are you just going off a standard like template?
It's using the CIS Kubernetes benchmark, and actually the website itself points out that it, or their GitHub page points out that it tries to stay in line with that as that changes, that's updated. But it really isn't that long. So it's only doing 30 or so checks, I think. It depends on how things are set up. It does more checks, if there's things that apply and don't apply. So it's quite a hard to tell. But yeah, it's not, I don't think it's customizable, but obviously you're spitting out the output. It would be easy enough to pull the pieces you wanted. The one thing about KubeBench is that a lot of the things it looks at, or a lot of the things it lists from the benchmark, are things that you have to check manually. There's things, warnings that you have to do a little bit more research on instead of an outright fail or pass. And then there's things that are kind of like, here are your manual things to look at. But it is numbered. If you download the PDF file for the CIS benchmarks, it matches up, with exactly the way it reads out there. So if you're going through, just like if you're applying a STIG, you have all the controls you're supposed to meet. It does the same type of thing with those. So you can match it up and use it for compliance if that's something you need to do. Which in our case, it was something we need to do. We have to match up with, they just came out with the container security SRG, which is a precursor to a STIG. If you know anything about STIGs, it has no oval content in an SRG. It's just the guidelines. So just the things you have to do, but no code to actually make it happen. But the CIS doesn't match up word for word or in order, but everything I could find in the SRG, I could find in the CIS benchmark as well, which is why we're looking at that. So, if you could get it to be compliant with KubeBench, it's compliant with the guidelines in the CIS container benchmark or Kubernetes benchmark, and then it's going to match up pretty well with the container security SRG from DISA. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I hope that was useful, and thank you, David, for presenting.
My pleasure.
Like I said, we do try to meet every third Wednesday at around the same time. I am going to send out the announcements in just a few minutes for next month's rather. Like Mike had mentioned earlier, he'll be presenting on OpenShift and OpenShift developer tools. And we hope you'll be able to join us. And I'll stay around for a few minutes if anybody has any other questions, but thank you all for coming.
Thank you.